Hello, everyone. Close your eyes and imagine, if you will, stepping through a doorway in time. The year's 1348. Snow falls silently outside a small thatched cottage in the English countryside. Inside, a family huddles around a meager fire. There, breath visible in the frigid air, even within their own home. The wind howls through gaps in the wooden walls, carrying with it the promise of months of hardship ahead. This is not the romanticized winter of fairy tales or Christmas cards. This is medieval winter in all its brutal, unforgiving reality. Tonight, we embark on a journey through one of history's most challenging periods, when winter was not merely a season but a test of human endurance, ingenuity, and survival. We'll explore the medieval warm period's end, the onset of the Little Ice Age, and how ordinary people faced temperatures that could kill, food shortages that lasted months, and darkness that seemed eternal. Our story begins in the late 13th century, when the earth itself seemed to turn against humanity. For centuries, Europe had enjoyed what historians call the medieval warm period, roughly from 950 to 1250 CE. During these warmer centuries, crops flourished, populations grew, and civilizations expanded northward into previously uninhabitable regions. Vikings established settlements in Greenland, vineyards dotted the English countryside, and agricultural abundance supported the construction of magnificent cathedrals and the growth of medieval cities. But climate, as we know, is never constant. Tree ring data, ice core samples, and historical records paint a vivid picture of what began to unfold in the late 1200s. Temperatures began to drop gradually at first, then more dramatically. By 1300, average temperatures in Europe had fallen by approximately 2 degrees Celsius compared to the medieval warm period. This might seem insignificant to our modern sensibilities, but in an agricultural society where survival depended entirely on seasonal cycles, this cooling spelled disaster. The transition was not immediate, but rather a slow descent into what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that would persist from roughly 1300 to 1850. Contemporary chroniclers, though they lacked our modern understanding of climate science, documented the changes with growing alarm. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions unusual cold spells beginning in the 1280s. French monastic records speak of rivers freezing solid for months, something that had been rare in previous centuries. Consider the psychological impact on medieval populations who had no framework for understanding climate change. To them, the increasingly harsh winters must have seemed like divine punishment, a sign of approaching apocalypse, or perhaps the result of widespread sin requiring collective penance. Their worldview, dominated by religious interpretation of natural phenomena, provided no comfort in the face of environmental catastrophe they could neither understand nor control. The cooling was not uniform across Europe. Scandinavian countries, already accustomed to harsh winters, experienced the change as an intensification of existing challenges. But for regions like southern England, northern France, and the Germanic territories, the new climate regime represented a fundamental shift in living conditions. Areas that had been marginally suitable for agriculture became uninhabitable. Mountain passes that had remained open year-round began closing for months at a time, disrupting trade routes that had connected distant regions. Archaeological evidence supports the written records. Excavations of medieval settlements show clear patterns of abandonment in marginal areas during this period. Villages that had thrived during the medieval warm period were systematically abandoned as their agricultural base became unsustainable. In Scotland, settlements that had pushed northward during the warmer centuries retreated southward, leaving behind stone foundations and pottery shards as silent testimony to climate's power over human habitation. The demographic impact was immediate and severe. Population growth, which had characterized much of the High Middle Ages, began to slow and then reverse in many regions. This was not merely due to direct deaths from cold, though those certainly occurred, but from the cascade of consequences that followed. Crop failures, malnutrition, increased susceptibility to disease, and social upheaval that accompanied resource scarcity. Asterisk. The relationship between climate and agriculture in medieval Europe was direct and unforgiving. Unlike modern industrial agriculture with its heated greenhouses, chemical fertilizers, and global food distribution networks, medieval farming was entirely at the mercy of seasonal weather patterns. The growing season in northern Europe was already short during the medieval warm period. With the onset of cooler temperatures, that season contracted even further, creating an agricultural crisis that would define the late Middle Ages. The primary grain crops of medieval Europe, wheat, barley, oats, and rye, each had specific temperature and moisture requirements. Wheat, the most prestigious grain used for white bread consumed by the wealthy, required the longest, warmest growing season. As temperatures dropped, wheat cultivation became impossible in regions where it had previously thrived. This forced a shift toward hardier grains like rye and oats. But even these crops faced challenges from shortened growing seasons and unpredictable weather patterns. Contemporary agricultural manuals reveal the desperation of medieval farmers attempting to adapt to changing conditions. The Liber de Agricultura, written by various monastic authors during this period, contains increasingly desperate advice for dealing with crop failures. Farmers were advised to plant multiple varieties of grains to hedge against total failure, to collect and store alternative food sources like acorns and chestnuts, and to preserve every possible calorie through increasingly sophisticated food preservation techniques. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 stands as perhaps the most dramatic example of how climate change devastated medieval agriculture. This 7-year period of crop failures, caused by a combination of unusual cold and excessive rain, affected virtually all of northern Europe. Contemporary chroniclers describe scenes that read like accounts of apocalyptic horror. The Chronicle of Malmesbury reports that people were reduced to eating bark, roots, and in the most desperate cases, human flesh. Cannibalism, while rare, was documented in several regions during the worst years of the famine. The social consequences of agricultural failure rippled through every level of medieval society. Peasant families, who typically lived season to season, with minimal food reserves, were the first to suffer. But the crisis quickly moved up the social hierarchy. Medieval lords, whose wealth and power derived from agricultural surplus produced by their peasants, found their revenues collapsing. This economic stress contributed to social unrest and political instability that characterized much of the 14th century. Monasteries, which had traditionally served as centers of learning and charitable relief, found themselves overwhelmed by refugees seeking food and shelter. Monastic chronicles from this period describe enormous queues of desperate people at monastery gates, begging for bread or thin gruel. The monks, themselves facing reduced harvests from their own lands, struggled to maintain their charitable obligations while ensuring their own survival. The psychological toll of chronic food insecurity cannot be understated. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that their next meal depended entirely on factors beyond their control: weather, crop diseases, insect infestations, and warfare. This uncertainty created a cultural mentality of perpetual anxiety about survival that permeated medieval literature, art, and religious expression. Food preservation became a matter of life and death. Techniques that had been optional during abundant years became essential survival skills. Smoking, salting, drying, and fermentation were refined to extract maximum nutritional value from minimal resources. Root cellars, previously used primarily for convenience, became elaborate underground storage systems designed to preserve food through increasingly long winters. The impact on livestock was equally severe. Cattle, sheep, and pigs required fodder throughout the winter months. As crop yields declined, farmers faced impossible choices: feed grain to animals or to their families. Many chose to slaughter their breeding stock, providing short-term nutrition but eliminating future sources of meat, milk, and wool. This created a downward spiral where each winter became progressively more difficult to survive. Medieval architecture tells the story of human adaptation to brutal winters with remarkable clarity. The buildings that survived from this period were not merely aesthetic choices, but carefully engineered responses to environmental challenges that could mean the difference between life and death. Every architectural element, from the thickness of walls to the design of windows, reflected hard-learned lessons about surviving in a climate that showed no mercy to the unprepared. The great stone castles and cathedrals that dominate our image of medieval architecture were actually the exception rather than the rule. The vast majority of medieval people lived in structures that would seem impossibly primitive by modern standards. A typical peasant dwelling consisted of a single room shared by an entire family, sometimes including their livestock. These buildings were constructed with whatever materials were locally available: timber, stone, mud, thatch, and in some regions, even sod. The design of these humble structures reveals sophisticated understanding of heat conservation. Walls were built thick, often 2 to 3 feet in some regions, not merely for structural strength, but for thermal mass. During the day, these thick walls would absorb heat from fires, cooking, and even body warmth. At night, they would slowly release this stored heat, moderating the interior temperature. This thermal lag effect could mean the difference between surviving a particularly brutal night or succumbing to hypothermia. Windows were minimal and small, often covered with oiled cloth, animal membranes, or in wealthy households, expensive glass. The absence of large windows, which modern people might interpret as evidence of medieval ignorance about the benefits of natural light, actually represented sophisticated understanding of heat loss. Every square foot of window area represented a significant heat loss during winter months when maintaining interior temperature was literally a matter of survival. The central hearth dominated medieval domestic architecture. Unlike modern fireplaces with their chimneys and sophisticated ventilation systems, early medieval hearths were often simply fire pits in the center of the room, with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof. This design, while primitive seeming, actually maximized heat distribution throughout the living space. The smoke, before escaping, would circulate throughout the room, providing additional warmth and helping to preserve food items hung from the rafters. Chimney technology, when it began to appear in the 12th and 13th centuries, represented a major advancement in medieval comfort and survival. However, chimneys were expensive to construct and maintain, requiring skilled stonemasons and significant material investment. Most peasant families continued to rely on central hearths well into the early modern period. The wealthy, however, could afford the luxury of multiple fireplaces with proper chimneys, allowing them to heat specific rooms and escape the constant smoke that characterized poorer dwellings. Medieval builders developed ingenious solutions for maximizing heat retention. Sleeping areas were often elevated, taking advantage of the fact that warm air rises. In many regions, families would sleep in elevated alcoves or lofts, where body heat and rising warm air from the hearth below would create marginally more comfortable sleeping conditions. The practice of sharing sleeping spaces was not merely a matter of poverty, but a calculated survival strategy. Multiple bodies in close proximity generated collective warmth that could mean the difference between surviving the night and freezing to death. Medieval beds were often massive structures designed to accommodate entire families with heavy curtains, or wooden panels that could be closed to create an insulated sleeping chamber within the larger room. Rushes and straw served multiple purposes in medieval homes. Scattered on floors, they provided insulation from the cold ground while also absorbing moisture and odors. During winter months, these floor coverings became particularly important as they created an insulating barrier between inhabitants and the frozen earth below. The wealthy could afford imported carpets or tapestries, which served similar insulating functions while also displaying social status. The evolution of medieval clothing reflected the same survival imperatives that shaped architecture. Layering became an art form, with garments designed to trap warm air while allowing for movement and work. Woolen garments were particularly prized because wool retains its insulating properties even when damp, a crucial characteristic in the humid, poorly ventilated conditions of medieval homes. The wealthy could afford multiple layers of fine wool, silk, and fur, while peasants made do with coarser fabrics and relied heavily on animal skins and rough woolen cloth. Medieval people understood that extremities were the first parts of the body to suffer from cold exposure. Mittens, rather than gloves, were preferred because they allowed fingers to share warmth. Footwear was often stuffed with straw, wool, or fur to provide insulation. The wealthy could afford boots made from thick leather with fur lining, while peasants often wrapped their feet in strips of cloth and leather, creating primitive but effective protection against frostbite. The battle against cold in medieval times began before dawn and continued until the last ember died in the hearth. Fuel gathering was not a seasonal chore, but a constant, desperate occupation that consumed enormous amounts of time and energy. In forested regions, families would spend entire days searching for deadfall, cutting branches, and gathering any combustible material they could find. The competition for firewood was fierce, leading to conflicts between neighbors and even warfare between communities over access to wooded areas. Different types of fuel burned with varying efficiency and heat output. Hardwoods like oak and ash were prized for their long-burning properties and intense heat, but they were also the most difficult to cut and split with medieval tools. Softwoods like pine burned quickly but provided less heat, requiring constant attention to maintain fires. Peasants often had to make do with whatever they could find: twigs, bark, dried animal dung, and even bones scavenged from butchering. The wealthy could afford to purchase fuel, but even they faced challenges during particularly harsh winters, when transportation became impossible. Medieval account books from manor houses show enormous expenditures on firewood, sometimes consuming a significant portion of household budgets. The logistics of transporting fuel over snow-covered, muddy roads using ox-drawn carts or horse-drawn sledges was a major undertaking that required careful planning and significant resources. Peat cutting became a specialized occupation in regions where this fuel source was available. Peat, formed from partially decomposed organic matter in waterlogged conditions, burned slowly and provided steady heat. However, cutting peat required specific knowledge about which areas would yield the best fuel and when conditions were right. For harvesting, peat cutting was typically done during summer months, with the fuel dried and stored for winter use. Coal mining, while still in its infancy during the medieval period, began to develop in response to increasing fuel scarcity. Early coal mining was extremely dangerous, with miners working in primitive conditions without proper ventilation or safety equipment. The coal itself was often of poor quality, producing toxic smoke that made indoor air quality even worse than it already was. Nevertheless, in regions where coal was available, it became an increasingly important fuel source for those who could afford it. The management of fire was a specialized skill that could determine survival. Medieval people understood that different types of fires served different purposes. Banking fires for overnight burning required specific techniques to ensure coals would remain alive until morning while minimizing fuel consumption. This involved covering coals with ash to slow combustion while maintaining enough oxygen to prevent complete extinction. The morning fire-starting ritual was a moment of high anxiety. If the banked coals had died during the night, relighting the fire with primitive tools like flint and steel could take considerable time and effort. Fire safety in medieval buildings was a constant concern. The combination of open flames, combustible building materials, and crowded living conditions created enormous fire risks. Entire medieval cities were regularly destroyed by fires that started in individual homes and spread rapidly through neighborhoods. London experienced major fires in 1077, 1087, and 1135, each destroying large portions of the city. These disasters often occurred during winter months when fires were kept burning constantly and buildings were sealed against the cold, creating perfect conditions for rapid fire spread. The social implications of fire management extended beyond individual households. Communities developed elaborate systems for sharing fire and fuel resources. Neighborhood bread ovens were shared among multiple families, with carefully scheduled baking rotations that maximized fuel efficiency. These communal ovens remained hot for hours after bread baking, allowing families to cook other foods using residual heat. The wealthy sometimes allowed poorer neighbors to cook food in their larger hearths in exchange for labor or other services. Fire-related injuries were common and often fatal. Burns from open flames, scalding from boiling water, and smoke inhalation were regular occurrences in medieval households. Medical knowledge about treating burns was limited, and infection often set in quickly due to poor sanitary conditions. Children were particularly vulnerable as they spent long hours near fires. for warmth and often lacked the coordination to avoid accidents. The psychological impact of constant fire management cannot be understated. Medieval people lived with the knowledge that their fire was literally their lifeline. The fear of fire extinction created a culture of vigilance and anxiety that permeated daily life. Women, who were typically responsible for maintaining household fires, carried an enormous burden of responsibility. The failure to maintain adequate fire could result in the death of family members, creating constant pressure and stress. Lighting presented additional challenges during the long winter nights. Candles were expensive and made from tallow or beeswax, both precious commodities. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, produced poor light and unpleasant odors, but were more affordable than beeswax candles. Most peasant families relied on rush lights, reeds soaked in animal fat that burned briefly but provided minimal illumination. The wealthy could afford oil lamps burning various types of oil, from olive oil in Mediterranean regions to fish oil in coastal areas. The economics of heating created sharp social divisions that were particularly visible during winter months. Wealthy households could afford to heat multiple rooms, maintain fires throughout the night, and purchase high-quality fuel. They could also afford warm clothing, adequate food, and medical care when cold-related illnesses struck. Poor families often had to choose between heating and eating, leading to malnutrition that made them more susceptible to cold-related diseases. Water, that most basic necessity of life, became a formidable challenge during medieval winters. The freezing of water sources that had sustained communities for generations forced medieval people to develop ingenious methods for accessing and preserving this vital resource. Rivers that served as highways for trade and communication during warmer months became impassable barriers of ice. Wells that had provided clean water for centuries froze solid, sometimes to depths of 10 feet or more. The Thames River in London provides one of the most dramatic examples of how thoroughly medieval winters could transform the landscape. Historical records document the Thames freezing completely solid on multiple occasions during the medieval period. The winter of 1281 to 1282 saw the river frozen for months, with ice thick enough to support entire markets. Merchants set up temporary stalls on the frozen surface, creating what became known as frost fairs. While these events might seem festive to modern observers, they represented profound disruption to the normal flow of commerce and daily life. Similar freezing occurred throughout northern Europe. The Rhine River, a crucial trade artery connecting the heart of Europe to the North Sea, froze solid during the winter of 1234, halting all river traffic for months. The economic impact was devastating, as cities dependent on river trade found themselves completely cut off from their normal supply chains. Food, fuel, and manufactured goods that would normally arrive by boat simply couldn't reach their destinations. While construction in medieval times was a massive undertaking that required specialized knowledge and significant investment. Wells were typically dug by hand, with workers descending into increasingly deep shafts using primitive tools. The deeper the well, the more likely it was to provide water even during dry periods, but also the more expensive and dangerous it was to construct. When these expensive installations froze solid, communities faced existential crises. Medieval people developed various techniques for preventing wells from freezing completely. Covering wells with thick wooden lids and surrounding them with straw or other insulating materials could sometimes prevent complete freezing. Some communities built small structures around their wells, creating primitive well houses that provided protection from wind and helped retain ground heat. In extreme cases, people would lower burning materials into wells to melt ice, though this was dangerous and could contaminate the water supply. The search for alternative water sources during frozen periods led to increasingly desperate measures. Snow and ice could be melted for water, but this required enormous amounts of fuel that was already scarce and needed for heating and cooking. The melting process was also time-consuming and produced relatively small amounts of water. A family might burn precious firewood for hours to produce enough water for a single day's drinking needs. Ice harvesting became a crucial winter activity in many regions. Communities would organize collective efforts to cut and store ice from frozen ponds and rivers. This ice could then be stored in specially constructed ice houses, underground chambers insulated with straw, sawdust, or earth. The ice would be melted as needed throughout the winter and into the spring months. However, ice harvesting was dangerous work, with workers risking falls through thin ice or injury from the sharp tools used to cut ice blocks. The quality of available water during winter months was often poor. Stagnant water from melted snow and ice could contain harmful bacteria and parasites. Medieval people had limited understanding of waterborne diseases, but they did recognize that some water sources were more likely to cause illness than others. They preferred running water when available, and sometimes added wine or ale to questionable water sources, believing this would make them safer to drink. Water storage became a critical household skill during winter months. Containers had to be kept in heated areas to prevent freezing, which meant valuable space near fires had to be dedicated to water storage rather than other uses. Large pottery vessels, wooden barrels, and leather containers were all used for water storage, each with advantages and disadvantages. Pottery vessels could crack when water froze, wooden barrels could split, and leather containers could freeze solid and become unusable. The absence of reliable water supplies had cascading effects on other aspects of medieval life. Cooking became more difficult when water had to be rationed. Personal hygiene, already challenging in medieval times, became nearly impossible when water was scarce. Laundry, typically done with large quantities of water, might be postponed for months during the worst winter periods. The accumulated effects of poor hygiene contributed to the spread of diseases that were already more common during winter months. Monasteries and wealthy households sometimes invested in elaborate water systems designed to function even during harsh winters. These might include covered conduits carrying water from distant springs, underground channels that were less likely to freeze, or sophisticated storage systems that could maintain supplies for extended periods. The Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, for example, had an elaborate water system with multiple sources and storage points, ensuring that the monks had access to water even during the harshest winters. The psychological impact of water scarcity was profound. Medieval people understood that humans could survive for weeks without food, but only days without water. The knowledge that their water supply could be cut off at any moment by freezing weather created constant anxiety. Families would hoard water whenever possible, keeping reserves even when it meant using valuable space and fuel to prevent freezing. Community cooperation around water resources was essential for survival. Neighborhoods would often share the burden of maintaining access to frozen wells, with different families taking turns at the dangerous and exhausting work of breaking through ice. Wells that served multiple families required careful management to ensure everyone had access while preventing contamination. These shared resources sometimes became sources of conflict when desperation overcame community cooperation. Food scarcity during medieval winters was not merely inconvenient, it was a death sentence for thousands. The complex web of agricultural production, food preservation, and distribution that sustained medieval populations could collapse entirely when harsh weather persisted for months. Understanding the medieval food system requires recognizing that most people lived constantly on the edge of malnutrition, with winter representing the annual period when that edge became a cliff. The medieval agricultural calendar was precisely timed to natural seasons, with each month bringing specific tasks that were essential for survival. The harvest months of late summer and early autumn were not times of celebration, but periods of frantic activity, as communities raced to gather and preserve enough food to last through the winter. A single week of unexpected rain during harvest could ruin grain crops. An early frost could destroy vegetable gardens. These seemingly minor weather variations could determine whether a community would eat or starve during the coming winter. Grain storage was both art and science. In medieval times, wheat, barley, oats, and rye had to be harvested at precisely the right moisture content, thoroughly dried, and stored in conditions that would prevent spoilage from moisture, rodents, and insects. Medieval granaries were sophisticated structures designed to protect stored grain from these threats. They were typically raised on stone foundations to prevent rodent access, built with thick walls to moderate temperature fluctuations, and equipped with various devices to monitor and maintain proper storage conditions. The process of converting grain into edible food was labor-intensive and required careful resource management. Mills for grinding grain into flour were expensive to build and maintain, often owned by lords who charged substantial fees for their use. During harsh winters, mills might freeze or become inaccessible due to blocked roads, forcing people to grind grain by hand using querns, small stone mills that required enormous physical effort to operate. A day's worth of bread for a family might require hours of grinding work. Bread was the foundation of medieval diet, but bread making during winter presented unique challenges. The yeast cultures used for leavening were difficult to maintain in cold conditions. Baking required substantial amounts of fuel, which was already scarce. The ovens themselves might freeze and crack, requiring repairs that were difficult to make in winter conditions. Many families subsisted on unleavened bread or gruel during the worst winter months, receiving far less nutrition from their precious grain supplies. Meat preservation was crucial for winter survival, but the techniques available to medieval people were primitive and often unreliable. Smoking, salting, and drying could preserve meat for months, but the process required specific conditions and considerable expertise. Salt was expensive and often difficult to obtain, particularly in inland areas. Smoking required constant attention and substantial amounts of wood. Improperly preserved meat could spoil rapidly, leading to food poisoning that could be fatal in winter conditions. When medical help was unavailable, The slaughter of livestock in late autumn was timed to coincide with the onset of cold weather. That would help preserve meat. However, this timing created a feast or famine cycle where communities had abundant fresh meat in early winter, but had to rely entirely on preserved foods for the remainder of the season. The decision of which animals to slaughter and which to keep alive through winter was crucial. Breeding stock had to be maintained for future production. But keeping animals alive required feed that might be needed for human consumption. Dairy products provided essential nutrition during winter months, but milk production dropped dramatically in cold weather. Cows, goats, and sheep produced far less milk when temperatures dropped and quality fodder became scarce. Cheese-making allowed some preservation of dairy nutrition, but the process required specific temperature conditions that were difficult to maintain in unheated medieval buildings. Butter could be preserved in salt, but this required the same expensive salt needed for meat preservation. Wild foods became increasingly important as stored supplies dwindled. Medieval people possessed extensive knowledge about edible plants, nuts, roots, and berries that could supplement their diet during lean times. However, winter made most of these food sources unavailable. Nuts stored from autumn harvests could provide essential fats and proteins. Root vegetables buried in earth could sometimes survive freezing. Tree bark could be ground into flour as a desperate last resort, though it provided minimal nutrition and was difficult to digest. Fishing continued during winter months, in regions where water sources didn't freeze completely. Ice fishing required specialized knowledge and equipment, but could provide fresh protein when other sources were unavailable. Preserved fish, salted, smoked, or dried, formed an important part of winter diet in coastal regions and areas near major rivers. However, the same transportation problems that affected other foods also limited access to preserved fish in inland areas. The social dynamics of food distribution became particularly important during scarce winter months. Medieval society was strictly hierarchical, and this hierarchy determined who ate and who went hungry when food was scarce. Lords and clergy typically maintained adequate food supplies even during famines, while peasants starved. However, even the wealthy could face food shortages during particularly harsh winters when transportation systems collapsed entirely. Monastic communities, with their large landholdings and sophisticated food management systems, often served as refuges during times of scarcity. Monasteries maintained extensive granaries, sophisticated preservation systems, and distribution networks that could provide food relief during emergencies. However, these institutions also faced limitations during extreme weather events, and the demand for charitable food distribution often exceeded their capacity to provide it. The psychological effects of chronic hunger were profound and long-lasting. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that starvation was only one bad harvest away. This created a cultural mentality focused on accumulation and preservation that influenced every aspect of daily life. Food was never wasted. Scraps were carefully saved, and even the smallest morsel was treated as precious. This scarcity mindset affected religious practices, social relationships, and economic behavior throughout medieval society. Children were particularly vulnerable to malnutrition during winter months. Their growing bodies required more nutrition per pound of body weight than adults, but they were often the first to have their food rations reduced when supplies became scarce. Chronic malnutrition during childhood development had lifelong consequences, creating populations of adults who were smaller, weaker, and more susceptible to disease than properly nourished populations. The connection between nutrition and disease. Susceptibility was not understood in medieval times, but the correlation was clearly observable. Communities that experienced severe food shortages during winter months invariably faced disease outbreaks in the following spring. Weakened immune systems, vitamin deficiencies, and poor sanitary conditions created perfect conditions for epidemic. Diseases to spread rapidly through malnourished populations. Beyond the physical challenges of cold, hunger, and shelter, medieval winters imposed a psychological burden that was perhaps even more devastating than the material hardships. The extended darkness of northern European winters, combined with isolation, fear, and deprivation, created mental health crises that medieval people had no framework to understand or address. What we now recognize as seasonal affective disorder was then interpreted as demonic possession, divine punishment, or moral weakness. The astronomical reality of medieval winters was harsh beyond modern comprehension. In northern European latitudes, winter days could be as short as 7 or 8 hours, with the sun barely rising above the horizon even at midday. This limited daylight was often obscured by clouds, snow, and smoke from countless fires, creating conditions of near constant gloom. Medieval people spent most of their winter months in darkness, with only firelight and primitive candles to illuminate their world. The quality of available light was poor by any standard. Tallow candles produced flickering, smoky flames that provided minimal illumination while filling enclosed spaces with unpleasant odors. Rushlights burned for only short periods and gave off even less light. Oil lamps were expensive to operate and required constant maintenance. Most medieval people simply adapted to living in darkness, going to bed shortly after sunset and rising before dawn to maximize the use of available daylight. This extended darkness had profound effects on human physiology that medieval people could observe but not explain. What we now understand as disruptions to circadian rhythms and vitamin D deficiency were then seen as mysterious afflictions that struck randomly during winter months. People became lethargic, depressed, and prone to illness. Sleep patterns became irregular. Appetite decreased even when food was available. These symptoms were often attributed to supernatural causes or moral failings. The isolation imposed by winter weather compounded the psychological effects of darkness. Travel became extremely difficult or impossible for months at a time. Communities that had regular contact during warmer seasons found themselves completely cut off from the outside world. Individual households, already crowded into small spaces, became pressure cookers of interpersonal tension as families were forced into constant close proximity with no means of escape or privacy. Medieval houses were not designed for privacy or psychological comfort. Large families shared single rooms, with multiple generations living in spaces that would seem impossibly cramped by modern standards. The constant presence of other people, combined with the stress of survival, created conditions where minor disagreements could escalate into serious conflicts. Domestic violence increased during winter months, though it was rarely recorded in official documents due to social attitudes that considered family matters private. The absence of entertainment and intellectual stimulation during winter months created additional psychological burdens. Medieval people were accustomed to outdoor work, seasonal festivals, and community gatherings that provided social interaction and mental engagement. Winter eliminated most of these activities, leaving people with little to occupy their minds except worry about survival. The wealthy could afford books, musical instruments, and other forms of entertainment, but the vast majority of the population had no such distractions. Religious practices provided some psychological relief, but they also created additional anxieties. Medieval Christianity emphasized the sinful nature of humanity and the constant threat of divine punishment. During the hardships of winter, it was natural for people to interpret their suffering as evidence of God's displeasure. This created cycles of guilt and despair that compounded the psychological effects of isolation and deprivation. The concept of mental illness as we understand it today did not exist in medieval times. People experiencing what we would recognize as depression, anxiety, or other psychological disorders were often thought to be possessed by demons, cursed by witches, or suffering from an imbalance of bodily humors. Treatment options were limited and often harmful. Exorcism, bloodletting, and various herbal remedies were common approaches, but they provided little actual relief and sometimes made conditions worse. Suicide rates increased during winter months, though accurate statistics are impossible to determine due to the strong religious prohibition against self-harm. The Catholic Church considered suicide a mortal sin that condemned souls to eternal damnation, so deaths by suicide were often recorded as accidents or attributed to other causes. However, contemporary chronicles and church records contain enough references to suggest that winter-related despair drove many people to take their own lives. The effects of chronic stress on medieval populations were severe and long-lasting. The constant threat of starvation, freezing, and death created a state of perpetual anxiety that affected every aspect of life. This stress was particularly hard on women, who typically bore responsibility for managing household resources and caring for children and elderly family members. The psychological burden of making life and death decisions about food distribution and resource allocation fell heavily on those least able to control their circumstances. Children growing up in these conditions experienced developmental trauma that affected them throughout their lives. The combination of malnutrition, cold, darkness, and family stress created psychological scars that shaped personality development and social behavior. Medieval adults who had survived multiple harsh winters as children often displayed characteristics that modern psychology would recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The absence of effective medical care for both physical and mental health problems compounded the psychological effects of winter hardships. People who became ill or injured during winter months often had to endure months of pain and disability with no prospect of relief. The knowledge that minor injuries could become life-threatening infections and that there was no help available created constant background anxiety that affected entire communities. Community support systems, while present, were often overwhelmed during the worst winter months. Extended families, religious institutions, and neighborhood networks that normally provided mutual aid found themselves stretched beyond their capacity. The knowledge that even traditional support systems might fail created additional anxiety and social fragmentation that persisted long after winter conditions improved. The cultural memory of harsh winters affected medieval society for generations. Communities that had experienced particularly brutal winters passed down stories and practices designed to prevent similar suffering in the future. These cultural adaptations, while practical, also served to maintain a constant awareness of vulnerability. That influenced everything from economic behavior to religious practices. Medieval medicine during winter months faced challenges that would have overwhelmed even modern healthcare systems. The combination of cold-related injuries, malnutrition-induced illness, and epidemic diseases created perfect storms of medical crisis that medieval healers were completely unprepared to handle. Understanding the medical realities of medieval winters reveals the true scope of human suffering during these harsh seasons. The most immediate medical threats came from direct exposure to cold. Frostbite was a common and feared condition that could strike anyone who spent time outdoors during severe weather. Medieval understanding of frostbite was limited to basic observations about the progressive death of tissue and extremities. Treatment methods were often counterproductive, involving rapid rewarming that could cause additional tissue damage. The inability to prevent infection in frostbitten areas meant that minor cases often progressed to gangrene, requiring amputation or resulting in death from systemic infection. Hypothermia was another constant threat, particularly to the elderly, infants, and those weakened by malnutrition. Medieval people recognized the symptoms of severe cold exposure, confusion, lethargy, and eventual unconsciousness, but they had no effective treatments. The standard approach was to warm the affected person gradually, but without understanding of the physiological processes involved. This warming was often done too quickly or with methods that could cause additional harm. Respiratory illnesses proliferated in the cold, crowded, poorly ventilated conditions of medieval winter housing. What we would recognize as pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis spread rapidly through households and communities. Medieval physicians had various theories about the causes of these illnesses, ranging from imbalances in bodily humors to noxious vapors, but their treatments were largely ineffective. Bloodletting, the most common medical intervention, actually weakened patients who were already struggling with serious infections. The medieval understanding of disease transmission was rudimentary at best. The miasma theory, which attributed illness to bad air, led to some beneficial practices like avoiding obviously contaminated areas, but it also prevented the development of effective preventive measures. The close quarters necessitated by winter survival created perfect conditions for airborne disease transmission, but medieval people had no understanding of how to prevent this spread beyond prayer and superstition. Childbirth during winter months was particularly dangerous. Pregnant women who were already weakened by malnutrition and cold stress faced additional risks from the harsh conditions. Midwives, the primary providers of obstetric care, had to travel through dangerous winter conditions to reach laboring women. The cold buildings where births took place created additional risks for both mothers and newborns. Infant mortality rates, already high in medieval times, soared during winter months. The limited pharmacological resources available to medieval healers became even more restricted during winter. Many medicinal plants were unavailable during cold months, and stored herbal medicines lost potency over time. The transportation difficulties that affected food and fuel supplies also limited access to imported medicines and rare ingredients. Healers had to make do with whatever local resources they could gather and preserve. often relying on treatments of questionable effectiveness. Medieval surgery, primitive under the best conditions, became nearly impossible during winter months. The cold made it difficult to keep patients warm during procedures, and the poor lighting conditions made precision work extremely challenging. The lack of effective anesthesia meant that patients had to endure procedures while fully conscious, and the cold temperatures made shock and blood loss even more dangerous than usual. Mental health problems, while not recognized as medical conditions, in the modern sense, manifested in ways that medieval healers attempted to treat. What we would identify as seasonal affective disorder, depression, and anxiety were often attributed to supernatural causes or physical imbalances. Treatments ranged from herbal remedies to religious interventions, but none addressed the underlying causes of these winter-related psychological problems. The social hierarchy that characterized medieval society extended to medical care, with devastating consequences during winter emergencies. Wealthy individuals could afford to summon physicians even during harsh weather, while peasants had to rely on folk remedies and the charity of religious institutions. This disparity in access to medical care meant that the poor, who were already more vulnerable to winter-related health problems, were also least likely to receive effective treatment. Epidemic diseases found perfect conditions in winter weakened medieval populations. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, was particularly devastating during winter months when malnutrition and crowded living conditions made people more susceptible to infection. Other epidemic diseases, including various forms of flu, dysentery, and typhus, regularly swept through communities during winter months, often killing significant percentages of the population. The preservation and preparation of medicines presented unique challenges during winter months. Many herbal remedies required fresh preparation, but the plants needed were unavailable during cold seasons. Dried herbs lost potency over time, and the storage conditions in medieval buildings were often poor, leading to spoilage and contamination. The grinding, mixing, and preparation of medicines in cold conditions was difficult and often resulted in substandard preparations. Medieval hospitals, primarily run by religious institutions, faced overwhelming demand during winter months. These institutions, designed to provide basic care and shelter, were quickly overwhelmed by the number of people seeking help. The monasteries and convents that operated these hospitals were themselves struggling with the same resource shortages that affected the broader population, limiting their ability to provide effective care. The training and knowledge base of medieval healers was insufficient for the challenges they faced during winter emergencies. Medical education was limited to a small number of university-trained physicians who primarily served the wealthy. Most health care was provided by practitioners with minimal formal training, who relied on traditional knowledge passed down through generations. This traditional knowledge, while containing some effective treatments, was mixed with superstition and ineffective practices. The economic aspects of medical care created additional barriers during winter months. Even when effective treatments were available, many people could not afford to pay for them. The barter economy that characterized much of medieval life made it difficult to compensate healers when agricultural products were unavailable. This economic pressure meant that medical care was often delayed until conditions became critical, reducing the chances of successful treatment. The documentation of medical conditions and treatments from medieval winters is sparse, making it difficult to fully understand the scope of health problems faced by these populations. The high rates of illiteracy meant that detailed medical records were rare, and the focus on more immediate survival needs often meant that health problems were not recorded unless they affected important individuals or large numbers of people. The economic realities of medieval winters created a complex web of scarcity, debt, and exploitation that trapped entire populations in cycles of poverty and vulnerability. Understanding these economic dynamics reveals how environmental challenges translated into social and political structures that would shape European civilization for centuries. The harsh mathematics of survival, calculating caloric needs against available resources, weighing the costs of heating against the necessity of food, dominated every aspect of medieval economic life. During winter months, agricultural societies are inherently seasonal, but medieval Europe's economy was particularly vulnerable to winter disruptions because it lacked the complex storage, transportation, and trade networks that might have provided alternative sources of goods and services. When winter brought agricultural production to a halt, it simultaneously increased demand for stored resources while making transportation of goods from other regions nearly impossible. This combination created extreme price volatility that could determine who lived and who died. The price of grain, the foundation of medieval diet, could increase by 500% or more during harsh winters. These price increases were not simply matters of supply and demand in the modern economic sense, but life and death struggles that revealed the brutal realities of medieval social hierarchy. Wealthy landowners and merchants who had stored grain during abundant harvests could literally hold the power of life and death over their communities. The temptation to withhold grain from markets to drive prices even higher created moral and practical dilemmas that tested the social fabric of medieval society. Labor markets underwent dramatic transformations during winter months. Agricultural work, which employed the vast majority of the medieval population, essentially disappeared for months at a time. This created enormous populations of unemployed people with no means of earning income precisely when their need for resources was greatest. Some found work in food processing, textile production, or other indoor crafts. But these opportunities were limited and typically paid poorly. The fuel system that dominated medieval Europe was particularly ill-equipped to handle the economic stresses of harsh winters. Peasants who were bound to the land and obligated to provide labor and agricultural surplus to their lords found themselves in impossible situations when crops failed. They still owed feudal obligations, even when they had no means to fulfill them, creating debt burdens that could persist for generations. Lords, faced with reduced agricultural income, often increased demands on their peasants, creating cycles of exploitation that worsened during winter emergencies. Credit and debt relationships became matters of survival during winter months. Medieval banking was primitive, and most credit was extended by local merchants, lords, or religious institutions. Interest rates were often usurious, and the collateral required typically included land, tools, or future labor obligations. Families who borrowed grain or fuel to survive winter often found themselves in debt bondage that lasted for years. The Catholic Church's prohibition on usury was frequently ignored or circumvented through complex arrangements that disguised interest payments as fees or penalties. The transportation costs of moving goods during winter months created additional economic pressures. Roads became impassable, rivers froze, and the dangers of winter travel meant that merchants demanded premium prices for goods that could be delivered during harsh weather. A barrel of grain that cost one price in autumn might cost 5 times as much in late winter, not because of scarcity at the source, but because of the enormous costs and risks involved in transportation. Regional economic specialization, which provided benefits during normal times, became a liability during winter emergencies. Areas that focused on producing specific goods, wool in England, wine in France, grain in fertile valleys, found themselves vulnerable when their specialty products couldn't be traded for essential survival resources. The economic efficiency of specialization collapsed when transportation systems failed, forcing communities to become self-sufficient or face starvation. Urban areas faced unique economic challenges during winter months. Cities, which depended entirely on agricultural surplus from surrounding rural areas, could be completely cut off from food supplies when roads became impassable. Urban merchants and craftsmen, who typically earned higher incomes than rural peasants, found their wealth meaningless when there was simply no food available to purchase at any price. This led to urban-rural economic relationships that were often exploitative, with city dwellers forced to pay enormous premiums for basic survival. Resources. The monetary system of medieval Europe was based on precious metals, primarily silver, with limited amounts of gold in circulation. During winter emergencies, the velocity of money circulation slowed dramatically as people hoarded coins for essential purchases. This deflationary pressure made debts more difficult to repay and reduced economic activity even further. Barter systems often replaced monetary exchange, but these were inefficient and couldn't handle complex transactions. Taxation systems that worked adequately during prosperous times became instruments of oppression during winter hardships. Kings and lords continued to demand tax payments even when their subjects were starving. The inability to pay taxes could result in seizure of property, imprisonment, or other punishments that further reduced people's ability to survive harsh conditions. Some rulers recognized the futility of taxing destitute populations and provided tax relief during emergency periods. But this was exceptional rather than normal practice. The economic roles of women became particularly important during winter months when traditional male-dominated agricultural work was unavailable. Women's work in textile production, food preservation, and household management became essential for family survival. However, women's economic contributions were typically undervalued and poorly compensated, even when they represented the difference between survival and death. The economic dependency of women on male relatives or employers created additional vulnerabilities during winter. Emergencies. Insurance and risk management concepts that might have helped medieval communities deal with winter uncertainties were almost entirely absent. Some guilds and religious organizations provided mutual aid to their members, but these systems were informal and often inadequate during major emergencies. The concept of spreading risk across large populations through formal insurance mechanisms wouldn't develop until much later, leaving medieval communities vulnerable to catastrophic losses from single bad winters. The economic impact of winter extended far beyond the immediate season. A particularly harsh winter could disrupt economic relationships and create debt burdens that affected communities for years or even decades. Young people who should have been accumulating resources and establishing households found themselves supporting elderly relatives and paying off debts incurred during emergency periods. This created demographic and economic patterns that influenced medieval society for generations. Trade relationships that had developed over centuries could be permanently disrupted by single severe winters. Merchants who lost goods to winter storms or were unable to complete trading voyages might go bankrupt, eliminating trade connections that had supplied essential goods to distant communities. The rebuilding of these trade networks could take years, during which time communities remain more vulnerable to future winter emergencies. The economic lessons learned from winter hardships influenced medieval attitudes toward wealth accumulation, resource storage, and risk management. The experience of watching neighbors starve while grain rotted in distant warehouses created cultural values that emphasized local self-sufficiency and resource hoarding. These values, while rational responses to winter uncertainties, also limited economic development and technological innovation that might have improved living conditions over the long term. When the rational world of medieval life collapsed under the weight of winter's brutality, people turned to the supernatural, the mystical, and the desperate. Religious rituals, folk magic, and superstitious practices proliferated during harsh winters as communities sought intervention from powers beyond the natural world. These practices revealed the profound helplessness that medieval people felt when confronted with forces they could neither understand nor control. The Catholic Church provided the dominant framework for understanding and responding to winter hardships, but its explanations were not always comforting. Church doctrine taught that earthly suffering was either divine punishment for sin or a test of faith that would be rewarded in the afterlife. During particularly brutal winters, priests would lead communities in elaborate acts of penance, hoping to appease God's wrath and bring relief from the harsh conditions. These penitential processions often took place in the worst weather, with participants exposing themselves to additional cold and hardship in the hope of demonstrating their sincere repentance. Fasting, already a regular part of medieval religious practice, took on desperate urgency during winter food shortages. Communities would collectively pledge to reduce their food consumption even further, believing that voluntary sacrifice might convince God to end their suffering. These religious fasts, imposed on populations that were already malnourished, often worsened the very conditions they were meant to alleviate. The irony was lost on people who had no other framework for understanding their predicament. Saints associated with weather, agriculture, and protection became the focus of intense devotional activity during winter emergencies. Saint Eligius, patron saint of metal workers and horses, was invoked to protect animals from freezing. Saint Agatha was called upon to prevent fires that might destroy precious fuel supplies. Saint Blaise, associated with protection from throat ailments, received countless prayers as respiratory infections spread through winter communities. The proliferation of saint-specific prayers and rituals created a complex supernatural bureaucracy that people hoped might intercede on their behalf. Relics, physical objects associated with saints or biblical figures, were believed to possess miraculous powers that could provide protection from winter hardships. Churches and monasteries with significant relic collections became pilgrimage destinations during harsh winters, as people traveled dangerous distances hoping to touch or pray near these sacred objects. The bones of Saint Martin of Tours, patron Saint of soldiers and the poor were particularly sought after during winter months. The economic impact of these pilgrimages created additional burdens on communities that could barely support their own populations. Folk magic and pre-Christian practices persisted alongside official religious rituals, often blending together in ways that created unique local traditions. Weather magic, designed to influence atmospheric conditions, was practiced throughout medieval Europe despite official church disapproval. Rituals involving the burning of specific herbs, the arrangement of stones in particular patterns, or the recitation of ancient formulas were believed to have power over winter storms and cold temperatures. The practice of wassailing, traveling from house to house singing songs and offering blessings in exchange for food and drink, served both social and magical functions during winter months. These ritualized visits helped redistribute scarce resources while also performing magical rituals believed to ensure good fortune for the coming year. The songs and chants used in wassailing often contained elements that were much older than Christianity, preserving ancient magical practices within apparently harmless folk traditions. Divination practices flourished during winter uncertainty, as people desperately sought information about when conditions might improve. Reading animal entrails, interpreting cloud formations, and observing the behavior of birds were all used to predict weather patterns and the likely duration of winter hardships. While these practices had no actual predictive value, they provided psychological comfort to people who felt completely powerless in the face of environmental forces. The scapegoating of individuals or groups for winter hardships was a common and dangerous practice. Jews, who were already marginalized in medieval society, often faced accusations of causing bad weather through magical practices or divine curse. Women suspected of witchcraft were similarly blamed for harsh winters, leading to persecution and violence that added human cruelty to natural suffering. These scapegoating practices provided communities with targets for their anger and frustration while doing nothing to address the actual causes of their hardships. Protective charms and amulets were worn and displayed throughout medieval communities. During winter months, small pieces of blessed bread, fragments of palm fronds from Palm Sunday, or written prayers were believed to provide protection from cold, hunger, and disease. The creation and distribution of these protective objects became a significant economic activity, with skilled craftsmen producing increasingly elaborate charms for those who could afford them. The timing of religious festivals and holy days was often adjusted to address winter-specific concerns. The Feast of St. Blaise, celebrated on February 3rd, included the blessing of throats to prevent respiratory illnesses that were common during late winter months. Candlemas, celebrated on February 2nd, involved the blessing of candles that would provide light and warmth during the darkest winter days. These adaptations of religious calendar to seasonal needs show how deeply winter hardships penetrated medieval spiritual life. Collective vows and promises made by entire communities during winter emergencies created long-term religious obligations that persisted for generations. A community might vow to build a new church, establish an annual pilgrimage, or perform specific religious rituals in perpetuity if they survived a particularly harsh winter. These vows, made in desperation, often impose significant economic and social burdens on future generations who inherited the obligation to fulfill promises made during emergency situations. The psychological functions of these ritual practices were probably more important than any supernatural effects they might have been believed to possess. Participating in collective rituals provided social cohesion during times when communities were under extreme stress. The act of doing something, even if it was ultimately ineffective, helped people feel less helpless in the face of overwhelming challenges. These rituals also provided structure and meaning during periods when normal social and economic activities were impossible. The documentation of miraculous events during harsh winters became an important part of medieval historical record keeping. Chronicles maintained by monasteries carefully recorded instances where divine intervention was believed to have provided relief from winter hardships. These accounts, while historically unreliable, provide insight into the psychological and spiritual responses of medieval people to environmental challenges that exceeded their ability to cope through purely practical means. The youngest members of medieval society bore the heaviest burden of winter's brutality, yet their stories are often the least documented in historical records. Children, with their higher metabolic needs, developing immune systems, and complete dependence on adult care, face mortality rates during harsh winters that would shock modern sensibilities. Understanding the experience of medieval children during winter months reveals both the profound vulnerability of the young and the desperate measures adults took to protect them. Infant mortality, already tragically high in medieval times, soared during winter months. Newborns require enormous amounts of energy to maintain body temperature, but medieval homes provided minimal protection from cold. Babies born during winter months faced immediate threats from hypothermia, respiratory infections, and malnutrition, as their mothers struggled to produce adequate breast milk while dealing with their own nutritional deficiencies. The practice of swaddling infants while providing some warmth also restricted movement that might have helped babies generate body heat. The medieval understanding of child development was limited, and the special nutritional needs of growing children were not well understood. Children received smaller portions of food during winter rationing, but their actual caloric needs per pound of body weight were higher than those of adults. This disconnect between nutritional needs and food allocation resulted in widespread malnutrition among children that had lasting effects on their physical and cognitive development. Stunted growth, weakened bones, and developmental delays were common among children who survived multiple harsh winters. Child labor took on different characteristics during winter months, but remained an essential part of family survival strategies. Children too young for outdoor agricultural work were assigned indoor tasks that helped families cope with winter challenges. These might include sorting and processing stored food, helping with textile production, maintaining fires, or caring for younger siblings. While these tasks were less physically demanding than summer agricultural work, they still required long hours and careful attention from children who were often weak from malnutrition and cold out. The education of children, limited under the best circumstances in medieval times, virtually disappeared during harsh winters. The few schools that existed, typically run by religious institutions, often closed during the worst weather when travel became impossible and fuel for heating buildings was too expensive. Children from wealthy families might continue to receive private tutoring, but the vast majority of medieval children received no formal education and were often illiterate. The loss of educational opportunities during extended winter periods had generational effects on intellectual development and social mobility. Orphaned Children faced particularly dire circumstances during winter months. Extended family networks that normally provided care for parentless children were often stretched beyond their capacity during winter emergencies. Monasteries and other religious institutions tried to provide care for orphans, but they were overwhelmed by the number of children needing help. Many orphan children simply died during harsh winters, their deaths often unrecorded in official documents. The psychological impact of winter hardships on children was severe and long-lasting. Children who experienced the trauma of watching family members die from starvation, cold, or disease carried these experiences throughout their lives. The constant anxiety about survival, the witness to adult desperation, and the experience of chronic hunger and cold created psychological patterns that affected personality development and social behavior. Medieval adults who had survived multiple harsh winters as children often displayed characteristics that modern psychology would recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Games and play activities that might have provided psychological relief for children were limited during winter months. Outdoor games were impossible during harsh weather, and indoor spaces were too crowded and focused on survival activities to allow for much recreational activity. The few toys available to medieval children were often repurposed as tools or fuel during emergency situations. The absence of play and recreational activity deprived children of important developmental experiences and added to the psychological burden of winter survival. Child mortality during winter months created profound impacts on family structure and community demographics. Families that lost children during harsh winters faced not only emotional trauma but also practical challenges, as children represented future labor and support in old age. Communities that lost significant numbers of children faced long-term demographic challenges that affected their ability to maintain population levels and economic productivity. The special vulnerability of children to cold-related injuries was well recognized in medieval times, but effective treatments were limited. Children's smaller body mass and higher surface area to volume ratio made them more susceptible to hypothermia and frostbite. Their natural tendency to explore and play made them more likely to be exposed to dangerous conditions. Traditional treatments for cold-related injuries were often inappropriate for children and sometimes caused additional harm. Childhood diseases that were manageable during warmer months became deadly during winter periods. Respiratory infections, digestive disorders, and skin conditions were all exacerbated by cold, malnutrition, and crowded living conditions. The medieval understanding of child-specific medical needs was minimal, and most treatments were simply scaled-down versions of adult remedies that were often ineffective or harmful when applied to children. The emotional bonds between parents and children were tested by the harsh realities of winter survival. Parents faced impossible choices about resource allocation, sometimes having to choose which children to feed when food was scarce. These decisions created family dynamics of favoritism and resentment that could persist long after winter conditions improved. The guilt and trauma experienced by parents who couldn't adequately protect their children added to the psychological burden of winter survival. Cultural practices around child rearing adapted to winter realities in ways that seem harsh by modern standards. Children were expected to contribute to family survival from very young ages, and childhood as a protected period of development was a luxury that most medieval families could not afford. The high mortality rates meant that emotional investment in very young children was often limited, as parents protected themselves psychologically from the grief of losing children they had come to love. The few written records that mention children during medieval winters typically focus on the deaths of children from wealthy families or on exceptional circumstances that affected large numbers of children simultaneously. The daily experiences of ordinary children surviving harsh winters are largely absent from historical records, making it difficult to fully understand the extent of childhood suffering during these periods. The long-term effects of childhood winter. Trauma influenced medieval society in ways that are difficult to measure, but undoubtedly significant. Adults who had survived harsh winters as children often displayed heightened anxiety about resource security, difficulty trusting in future stability, an intense focus on accumulating and preserving resources. These psychological patterns, multiplied across entire populations, influenced economic behavior, social relationships, and cultural values throughout medieval society. As winter's grip slowly loosened its hold on medieval Europe, the transition to spring brought both hope and new challenges that tested communities already weakened by months of hardship. The end of winter was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual process that could take months to complete, during which time communities remained vulnerable to sudden reversals that could prove even more devastating than the original winter conditions. The first signs of spring's approach were eagerly watched for and carefully interpreted by medieval people who had survived another brutal winter. The behavior of animals, the direction of winds, the appearance of certain plants, and the patterns of ice melting on rivers and ponds were all observed as indicators of changing seasons. However, medieval people also understood that false springs could be deadly traps, luring the unwary into relaxing their survival vigilance before winter had truly ended. Late winter thaws followed by sudden freezes created some of the most dangerous conditions of the entire winter season. These freeze-thaw cycles could destroy stored food supplies that had been carefully preserved for months. Root vegetables buried in earth cellars could be ruined by alternating freezing and thawing. Stored grains could become moldy or infested with insects when containers cracked from temperature changes. The cruel irony was that supplies that had survived the worst of winter could be lost just as spring approached. The psychological impact of approaching spring was complex and often contradictory. While people felt enormous relief at the prospect of warmer weather and renewed food production, they also faced anxiety about whether their depleted resources would last until new crops could be harvested. The period between the end of winter and the first spring harvests was often called the Hungry Gap, a time when stored food supplies were exhausted, but new food sources were not yet available. Road conditions during the spring thaw created transportation challenges that were different from but equally serious as winter blockages. Frozen roads became muddy quagmires that could trap carts and animals. Rivers, swollen with snowmelt, became dangerous torrents that destroyed bridges and made fording impossible. The eagerness to resume trade and transportation after months of isolation often led to accidents and lost goods, as people underestimated the dangers of spring travel conditions. Spring flooding was a regular occurrence that could destroy communities that had survived the winter intact. Medieval settlements were often located near rivers for access to water and transportation, but spring floods could wash away entire villages. The combination of heavy snowmelt, frozen ground that couldn't absorb water, and ice dams that blocked river channels created flood conditions that were both predictable and devastating. The renewed availability of wild food sources provided crucial nutrition during the hungry gap between winter and spring harvests. Early spring plants like dandelions, wild garlic, and various shoots and leaves could provide essential vitamins and minerals to populations weakened by months of limited diet. However, the knowledge of which plants were safe to eat and when they were ready for harvest was specialized information that not everyone possessed. Mistakes in identifying edible plants could result in poisoning that was particularly dangerous to people already weakened by malnutrition. Agricultural activities resumed gradually as spring progressed, but communities weakened by winter hardships often lacked the energy and resources needed for effective farming. Seed grain that should have been planted might have been consumed during winter emergencies. Draft animals needed for plowing might have died or been slaughtered for food. Farm tools might have been burned for fuel or sold to purchase food. The cascade of decisions made for winter survival often compromised communities' ability to resume agricultural production in spring. The social and economic relationships that had been strained by winter hardships required careful reconstruction. As communities emerged from winter isolation, debts incurred during emergency periods had to be reckoned with. Family relationships damaged by the stress of survival had to be repaired. Community cooperation that had been essential for winter survival had to be reorganized for spring agricultural activities. These social reconstructions were often complicated by grief for family and community members who had not survived winter. Spring diseases presented new health challenges for populations weakened by winter hardships. The combination of improved weather that allowed for increased social contact and immune systems weakened by months of poor nutrition created perfect conditions for epidemic diseases. Smallpox, measles, and various forms of flu often spread rapidly through communities during spring months, sometimes killing people who had survived the worst of winter only to die as conditions improved. The resumption of trade and commerce as transportation became possible again was both eagerly anticipated and potentially dangerous. Communities desperate for goods they had been unable to obtain during winter months were vulnerable to exploitation by merchants who could demand premium prices for essential items. The eagerness to restore normal economic relationships sometimes led to agreements that were unfavorable to Bastu. Communities that had little bargaining power after months of hardship. Religious observances associated with spring took on special significance for communities that had survived harsh winters. Easter celebrations were particularly meaningful as symbols of renewal and resurrection that paralleled the revival of the natural world. However, communities that had lost significant numbers of people during winter months often found traditional celebrations hollow or painful reminders of those who were no longer present to participate. The documentation and memory of winter hardships became important community activities as spring progressed. Chronicles and records were updated to record the events of the harsh winter. Stories were told and retold, creating community memories that would influence future preparation and response to similar challenges. These community memories served both practical and psychological functions, preserving knowledge about survival strategies while also processing the trauma of the winter experience. Planning for future winters. began almost immediately as spring arrived. Communities that had survived harsh winters understood that their survival had often been a matter of luck as much as preparation, and they were eager to improve their chances for future survival. This planning involved everything from agricultural decisions about what crops to plant to architectural decisions about how to improve buildings to social decisions about how to better organize community. Resources. The gradual transition from winter survival mode to normal seasonal activities required careful management of limited resources and energy. People who had survived on minimal calories for months couldn't immediately return to full activity levels. Work had to be paced to avoid exhaustion, and nutrition had to be carefully managed to rebuild strength without overwhelming digestive systems that had adapted to starvation conditions. As our journey through the brutal winters of medieval Europe draws to a close, we find ourselves confronted with profound questions about human resilience, social organization, and the relationship between civilization and environment. These harsh seasons, which tested every aspect of medieval life, shaped not only individual lives, but the entire trajectory of European civilization. The lessons learned in the crucible of winter hardship influenced architecture, agriculture, economics, religion, and social structures in ways that persisted for centuries. The medieval warm periods and then the onset of the Little Ice Age represent one of history's most dramatic examples of how climate change can transform human society. The cooling temperatures that began in the late 13th century didn't simply make life more uncomfortable. They fundamentally altered the possibilities for human habitation, agricultural production, and social organization across an entire continent. The demographic collapse that followed, including events like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, reshaped European society in ways that are still visible today. The technological innovations that emerged from winter necessity, improved heating systems, better food preservation techniques, more efficient building designs, represent humanity's creative response to environmental challenges. Medieval people, working with limited scientific knowledge and primitive tools, develop solutions that maximize their chances of survival under extreme conditions. Many of these innovations continued to be used for centuries, testament to their effectiveness and the desperation that drove their development. The social solidarity that emerged during winter emergencies reveals both the best and worst of human nature under extreme stress. Communities that successfully survived harsh winters typically did so through cooperation, resource sharing, and collective action. However, the same conditions that promoted cooperation within groups often led to competition and conflict between groups. The scapegoating of minorities, the exploitation of the vulnerable, and the breakdown of social norms during extreme hardship show how quickly civilized behavior can deteriorate when survival is at stake. The economic lessons of medieval winters continue to resonate in modern discussions about economic resilience and sustainability. The collapse of trade networks, the volatility of essential commodity prices, and the vulnerability of specialized economies to transportation disruptions all have modern parallels. The medieval experience suggests that resilient economies require redundancy, local self-sufficiency, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. The religious and cultural responses to winter hardship provide insight into how societies make meaning from suffering and uncertainty. The proliferation of religious rituals, the development of new devotional practices, and the integration of winter survival into spiritual frameworks show how profoundly environmental challenges can influence cultural development. The persistence of many winter-related traditions and celebrations in modern European culture demonstrates the lasting impact of these historical experiences. The demographic impacts of harsh winters, high child mortality, shortened life expectancy, delayed family formation, created population dynamics that influenced European society for generations. The experience of childhood trauma, parental loss, and community devastation shape personalities and social relationships in ways that affected everything from economic behavior to artistic expression. Understanding these impacts helps explain many characteristics of medieval and early modern European culture that might otherwise seem puzzling. The technological stagnation that often accompanied harsh winters illustrates the tension between immediate survival needs and long-term development. Communities focused on surviving the next winter had little energy or resources to invest in innovations that might improve conditions in the future. This created cycles where harsh conditions prevented the very innovations that might have alleviated those conditions, trapping populations in patterns of recurring crisis. The environmental lessons of medieval winters are particularly relevant to modern concerns about climate change and environmental sustainability. The medieval experience demonstrates how relatively small changes in average temperature can have enormous consequences for human societies, especially those that are already operating near the margins of survival. The cascading effects of environmental change, from agricultural failure to economic collapse to social upheaval, provide cautionary examples for modern policymakers. The documentation challenges that limit our understanding of medieval winter experiences highlight the importance of preserving records of environmental and social conditions for future generations. Many aspects of medieval winter life remain poorly understood because the people who experienced them were too busy surviving to record their experiences, or because their records were not preserved. This suggests the importance of contemporary efforts to document and understand our own relationships with environmental challenges. The recovery patterns that followed harsh medieval winters provide insights into societal resilience and reconstruction. Communities that successfully rebuilt after winter devastation typically did so through careful resource management, gradual rebuilding of damaged infrastructure, and maintenance of social networks that have been strained by hardship. The speed and completeness of recovery often depended on factors like the availability of external aid, the preservation of essential knowledge and skills, and the maintenance of hope and social cohesion during the darkest periods. As we reflect on these historical experiences from the comfort of our modern, heated homes, it's important to recognize that the fundamental human vulnerabilities revealed by medieval winters have not disappeared. While technology has provided us with better tools for managing environmental challenges, we remain dependent on complex systems that could fail under extreme conditions. The medieval experience suggests that resilience requires not just technological solutions but also social cooperation, resource management skills, and the psychological fortitude to endure hardship while working toward better conditions. The story of medieval winters is ultimately a story about human adaptability and the complex relationships between environment, technology, and society. These harsh seasons revealed both the fragility and the resilience of human civilization, showing how quickly comfortable conditions can deteriorate while also demonstrating the remarkable capacity of people to survive and adapt under extreme conditions. The lessons learned in the crucible of medieval winter continue to offer insights for modern societies facing their own environmental and social challenges, in the quiet of a winter night. As snow falls outside your window and warmth surrounds you, take a moment to remember those who faced winter's full fury with nothing but their ingenuity, their community bonds, and their indomitable will to survive. Their struggles shaped the world we inhabit today, and their experiences remind us that the comfort we enjoy is neither permanent nor inevitable, but rather the result of centuries of human effort to master the challenges of our environment. The brutal winters of medieval Europe are more than historical curiosities. They are reminders of human vulnerability and testimonies to human resilience that continue to speak to us across the centuries.